In this lecture, we're going to replace our Euler angle representation using a quaternion. So previous lectures, we defined our equations of motion using our Euler angle representation. So we can see all the trig functions here. Now we're going to take that Euler angle representation and replace it with the quaternions. So let's go ahead and get started. We want to first just review quaternions. So we've seen most of what we're going to talk about in this lecture before. We want to make sure that we're really sharp on it. So our attitude, we can represent any rotation in a variety of different ways. We've talked about rotation matrices, we've talked about Euler angles, and we have talked about quaternions as well. So just as a reminder, we have our quaternion defined as E, and we do 0 through 3, or sometimes we'll write this as E naught, and then we'll do EX, EY, and EZ. Okay, so that's, in this book, that's what we'll call it. Be careful of your notation, though. For example, if you're going to be using Ross, they're going to define their quaternion, and they're going to give it an X component, a Y component, a Z component, and what they call the W component. So be really careful with your notation. Make sure you know E sub X or E sub 1, what that corresponds to. So this is, for example, Ross. But either way, in any case, we get 4 parameters. The top component, E naught, this is called our scalar component of the quaternion, and we refer to the E sub 1 through 3 as the vector part of the quaternion. Now, if you recall from previous lecture, that we described that any rotation can be described by a single axis of rotation and amount of rotation we're doing about that axis. So here's our aggregate rotation parameters, and we have our axis of rotation. So any rotation matrix, we can come bring it in, and we have our rotation and our rotation vector and our angle of rotation. Well, the reason why we have this nomenclature where E naught is the scalar part of the quaternion is because that the E naught does not depend on the vector. So no vector dependence. It solely depends on that magnitude of how much we're rotating about that axis. The vector part we can define as E1 through E3 is just going to be our vector multiplied by the sine of that angle. And that'll give us our unit quaternion, which is great. So we have our quaternion, unit quaternion. We're going to ensure that the magnitude is equal to 1. Okay, so let's write that here. So unit is, then we'll take our E naught through E3. I keep writing a curly on one, and all right, and normalize it. So we'll just divide by the magnitude of all those variables. Okay, so if we're going to convert between our Euler angles and our quaternions, we need to define the relationship. And the relationship is really nicely defined. There's a little bit more discussion about it in the book, in one of the appendices, but we can just take our phi, theta, and psi, and we can define those directly in terms of our arctangents and our arcsines with the different components of the Euler angles. Now our a tan 2, just note that that's a fairly common notation for writing our arctangent, where we have our y and our x components. So basically it's the 4-quadrant tangent. So that avoids any of the singularities that you get with just taking your a10 and having something and dividing by 0 on one of the bottoms. Then we have, so we have that relationship, and we can also go the other way around, right? So in this one, we're taking our E and we're obtaining our phi, theta, and psi. In this case, we're taking our attitude angles, and we're obtaining our quaternion representation. So we have this really nicely defined way to map back and forth between angles and quaternions. Similarly, we can convert between quaternions and rotation matrices. So we can take our rotation matrix, and we can define that rotation matrix in terms of the individual elements of our quaternion. So this is really nice, so that we can take our quaternion, which goes from, if it goes from B to I, right, and we can immediately write our rotation matrix from the body frame to the inertial frame. So keep that in mind. We're defining our quaternion as such, right? So we've defined our angles, our quaternion, our rotation matrix in terms of our quaternion, and we can even go back and forth. Shown on a previous lecture, there's a nice mapping to go from rotation matrix to quaternions as well. Okay, so the book goes in, and basically most of it's a lot of substitution for all of these trig terms. Up here, it's just nice we can obtain the Euler angles from our quaternion. And so we don't really need to change that at all. But what we do have here is now we have a nice time derivative of our quaternion. Okay, so the equations of motion, the other benefit of it is that these equations of motions are linear, right? So given our quaternion, and we have this, well, it's really bilinear in terms of our state, where we have just the state, our current rotational velocities, and we multiply it by our current quaternion. So we have a much simpler set of state equations, at least in terms of the time derivative of our quaternion. Okay, excellent. So we can now take these equations and we can simulate forward in time. We have one caveat, and that is that we have to make sure that the magnitude of our quaternion is equal to 1. And so we'll see that it's provided for you in code, but here's just some details for that as well. So after we do our RK4 update, we just need to make sure that we've normalized E. The bottom, so this is so we'll divide into two. If you're up in Python or you're creating your own integrator, you're going to just make sure that when you update E, just make sure that you normalize it. And down below, you can use other techniques basically just to normalize it in the ODE solver. You make it really stiff to make sure that it's always trying to converge to that unit magnitude. But then you have to use a stiff solver, and so you got to make sure to be careful with that. So if you're using MATLAB and you're using this technique, make sure you're using a stiff solver. The reason you have to do this technique down below is if you have an adaptive step size. So you have to be careful with that adaptive step size. So this is just a technique to help normalize that quaternion. So equations of motion are simpler, but just be careful. It needs to be a unit quaternion. Okay, excellent. So now we've defined our equations of motion in both Euler angles and quaternions. And in the next lecture, we'll then talk about how do we use these time derivatives to simulate our system.